14th of October 1943. You are a waist gunner in a B-17, packed into a formation of nearly 300 of them, grinding east toward a ball-bearing town called Schweinfurt. Below the wing, the last friendly fighter peels off and turns for England. Its tanks are dry. From here, the target is another 200 miles of German sky, and you will fly every mile of it alone. Then they come. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s wheeling in from dead ahead, cannon flashing, closing so fast the gunners barely get a burst off. The bomber on your right wing takes a 30mm shell in the wing root and slides out of formation. That was the arithmetic of the deep raid in the autumn of 1943. The bombers went in without an escort, and the German fighters set the price. What broke that arithmetic was a single American fighter that could do the one thing every general had been told was impossible. It was the P-51 Mustang, and by March it would fly all the way to Berlin and back. This is the story of how it got there and what it did to the German fighter arm when it arrived. The weapon that ruled the sky was the Focke-Wulf 190, one of the finest piston fighters any Air Force flew in the war. Against a heavy bomber, it was devastating. A version built specially for the job carried twin 30mm cannon in the wings, and a single hit from one of those shells could tear a wing spar in half. The Germans bolted extra armor plate around the cockpit and thick armored glass in front of the pilot, so he could bore straight in through the bomber's fire and not flinch. The tactic was the head-on pass. A German pilot would climb above the American formation, roll in from the front, and dive through it nose to nose. The closing speed of the two aircraft together ran well past 500 miles an hour. A bomber gunner had a second, maybe less, to track a fighter coming at him that fast. The head-on angle also showed the German pilot the fewest guns, because a B-17 carried most of its defensive firepower to the sides and the tail, not the nose. Some of the fighters slung a pair of heavy rockets under the wings and lobbed them into the tight formations from outside machine gun range, breaking the boxes apart so the single-engine fighters could pick off the stragglers. Two German fighters split the work by height. The Focke-Wulf 190 flew a radial engine that gave superb power and handling down low, but its breath ran short above about 20,000 feet, so it did its best work in the middle air where the closing passes happened. The Messerschmitt 109, lighter and better winded up high, often flew top cover, holding the ceiling and diving on any escort that came up. Between them, they layered the sky. A bomber climbing into Germany had a fighter waiting at nearly every altitude it could reach. The bombers flew in those tight boxes for exactly this reason. Packed close, their 50 caliber machine guns overlapped into a wall of fire, and a formation that held its shape could defend itself. A formation that got broken up could not. The whole German method was to break the box, then hunt the loners. And in the autumn of 1943, over the middle of Germany, there was nothing to stop them from trying. Schweinfurt is where the price came due. The town made a huge share of Germany's ball bearings, the small steel parts that every engine and gun turret in the Reich turned on. The American planners believed that if they could wreck the bearing factories, they could seize the whole German war machine by the throat. On the 14th of October, the 8th Air Force sent 291 B-17s to do it. The escort fighters took the bombers as far as the German border and then turned back, out of fuel. The Luftwaffe knew the routine cold. Their controllers held the fighters on the ground until the little friends had gone home, then threw the full weight of the day fighter force at the bombers for the whole long run to the target and back. For hours, the formations fought without a friend in the sky. 60 B-17s did not come home. Another 17 were so badly shot up they were scrapped on landing, and more than 100 of the survivors came back whole. Close to 600 men were casualties, lost or wounded or missing, roughly 1 in 5 of everyone who flew. In the histories, the day carries a single grim name. They called it Black Thursday. It was not the first time. 2 months before, on the 17th of August, the 8th had sent a combined force against Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt works at Regensburg on the same day. Of 376 bombers dispatched, 60 went down, and the Schweinfurt half of the force alone lost 36 of its 230 aircraft. 2 raids and 2 disasters. The lesson was impossible to argue with. A bomber crewman could work the odds himself. Tour was 25 missions. When a single deep raid could take 1 bomber in 5, the odds said a man would not live to finish his tour. The crews knew that math. They knew it before every briefing, and the run of losses through the autumn of 1943 drove morale in the bomb groups to the floor. The 8th Air Force could not run deep daylight raids into Germany without an escort that stayed the whole way. After Black Thursday, the deep penetration missions stopped. For 4 months, the bombers did not go back to Schweinfurt. Only targets inside fighter range were flown. The command waited for new crews and new aircraft, and for some way to reach the far targets and come back. The German fighter had won, and everyone on both sides knew it. Here is where the story turns on a hard fact of engineering. The American fighters of 1943 could not reach the targets. The best escort the 8th Air Force had was the P-47 Thunderbolt, a big, tough, superb machine, and on internal fuel, it could carry the bombers only about 125 miles into enemy territory before it had to turn for home. Hang a belly tank under it, and that stretched to a little over 200 miles. Bolt on a bigger paper tank late in the year, and you got a little past 270. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning reached farther, but in the freezing air 5 miles up, its engines threw problems, and there were never enough of them. 270 miles was not enough. Berlin sat more than 500 miles from the English coast. Schweinfurt was better than 400. The escort could walk the bombers to the door of Germany and no farther, and the Germans had built their entire defense around that gap. They waited in it. Every mile past the point where the Thunderbolts turned around belonged to the Focke-Wulf and the Messerschmitt. The strange part is that the aircraft which would close that gap already existed. it had for more than a year. The Mustang started life as a fighter, North American aviation built to a British order in 1940. It flew beautifully low down, and it flew a long way because its designers had given it a slick new wing that slipped through the air with very little drag and a big fuel load tucked inside. High up, though, its first engine ran out of breath, and the American Air Force filed it away as a ground attack machine and a photo plane. The one thing nobody had is the thing that would win the air war, and it was sitting in a hangar being used for the wrong job. The fix came from a British test pilot and an engine. In the spring of 1942, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronnie Harker was invited to fly one of the Allison-powered Mustangs. He came away impressed with how the airframe handled and how far it could go, and unimpressed with how it gasped for breath up high. Harker wrote a short note that changed the war. Fit this airplane with the Rolls-Royce Merlin, he argued, the same supercharged engine that gave the Spitfire its bite in the thin air, and you would have something remarkable. The British re-engined a handful of Mustangs to test the idea. The first one flew that October, and the numbers were extraordinary. Bat settled it. British and American engineers married the Mustang airframe to the Merlin. In the United States, the Packard Motor Car Company tooled up to build the British engine under license by the tens of thousands. Every airframe rolling out of North Americans' plants had a Merlin waiting for it. With the Merlin bolted in, the long-ranging airframe had a heart that kept pulling at 25 and 30,000 feet, right where the bombers flew and the fights happened. The result was a fighter that could stay with a German interceptor in a turning fight, dive with it and climb after it, and still have the fuel to do it hundreds of miles from home. Fuel was the whole trick, and the Mustang was built to hoard it. The early Merlin version carried 184 gallons inside its wings. Then the engineers added a tank of 85 gallons behind the pilot's seat, which pushed the internal load to 269 gallons. Under the wings, it could carry 2 drop tanks on top of that, each holding 108 gallons, cheap disposable tanks the pilot could punch off the instant a fight started. The pilots learned to burn the fuselage tank down first, then run on the drop tanks about halfway to Berlin, saving the clean internal wing fuel for the fight and the ride home. Full up, a Mustang carried enough to fly more than 1,000 miles round trip, reach the German capital, fight over it, and come home with a reserve. It fought with 450 caliber machine guns in the wings, later Marks with 6. That was a lighter punch than the German 30mm cannon, but plenty to hammer a single-engine fighter. Better still, it fired them from a platform that held its performance exactly where the Focke-Wulf lost its own. High over Germany, the Mustang was in its element, and the Focke-Wulf was straining. That mattered more than any single number on the specification sheet. Climbing above the threat and diving through it no longer worked for the German pilot, because the threat could climb with him. Cash that fuel figure into what it meant on the map. For the first time, an American single-engine fighter could take off in England, cross the whole of occupied Europe, arrive over Berlin at the same moment as the bombers, and still have the legs to fight a Messerschmitt over the target and fly back. The gap the Germans had built their defense inside simply closed. There was no longer a stretch of the mission where the bombers were alone. That is the payoff the whole video is about, and it was true the day the Merlin Mustang crossed the coast. The first Merlin Mustangs reached England in November of 1943 with the 354th Fighter Group. They flew their first mission on the 1st of December, a sweep over France. Within 2 weeks, they were escorting bombers to Kiel, 480 miles out, deeper than any single-engine escort had ever gone. The Germans, who had been told there were no long-range fighters that could reach that far, suddenly found American fighters waiting where they had always been safe. Then a general changed the rules. In January of 1944, James Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force. On the wall at fighter headquarters hung a sign that read, "The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." Doolittle had it taken down. He put up a new one. It read, "The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters." That sounds like a small change of wording. The Mustangs did not fly the whole route alone. The 8th built its escort in relays. Short-legged Thunderbolts covered the bombers on the way in and handed them off at a rendezvous point. A middle group took the next stretch. The long-ranging Mustangs took the deepest leg, over the target and back to the handoff, the part of the mission that used to belong to the German fighter, with nobody there to argue. Fresh groups took off hours apart and flew economically to save fuel for their own zone, so that from the English coast to Berlin and home again, there was never a mile without a friend, somewhere above the formation. The Mustang made the deep leg possible, and the relay made it seamless. Until then, the escorts had been chained to the bombers, forced to fly slow alongside them and only react when the Germans attacked. Doolittle cut them loose. Cut loose, the Mustangs ranged out ahead and to the sides, hunting the German fighters in the air, chasing them down toward their own runways, catching them as they climbed to attack and as they landed low on fuel. The bombers had become bait. The Luftwaffe had to come up to fight the bombers, and when it came up, the Mustangs were waiting to take it apart. German day fighter losses climbed month over month. In January, the Luftwaffe lost about 30% of its fighter pilots. In February, 30% again. In March, 56%. The trap sprang shut in the last week of February. The Americans launched a series of raids they called Big Week, aimed square at the German aircraft factories, and the real target was not the buildings. It was the fighters that had to rise to defend them. Over 6 days, the 8th Air Force flew about 3,000 bomber sorties and paid for them, close to 100 B-17s and 40 more Liberators lost. But under the escort, the German fighter arm was being ground down faster than it could be rebuilt. On a single mission, the defenders lost 153 fighters. The airframes Germany could replace. The experienced pilots it could not. More than 100 trained fighter pilots were gone by the end of the week, and there was no reserve of veterans to fill the empty cockpits. The bombers went after the aircraft factories at places like Regensburg, Leipzig, and Gotha, the plants that built the very fighters rising to defend them. That gave the German commanders no choice. They had to send their fighters up, or watch the factories that made more fighters be wrecked. Either the bombs got through, or the interceptors came up and met the Mustangs. Both roads ran downhill for Germany. 8th was no longer just trying to hit a target. It was using the target as a lure to draw the German fighter arm into a fight it could not win and could not walk away from. The scoreboard tells the rest. Through the first 3 months of 1944, the German day fighter force was worn down faster every month, and the escort groups that flew the deep legs began to run up long lists of claims over Germany. The 4th Fighter Group and the 357th, the first Mustang units in the 8th, fought over Berlin in that first week of March and were honored for holding the escort together against everything the defenders could throw up. The pattern held into the spring. Wherever the bombers went, the Mustangs went, and the German controllers grew more careful about when they dared commit their thinning ranks of pilots. Now stand in the cockpit for the payoff. The 4th of March, 1944. If you were flying a Mustang of the 4th Fighter Group that morning, led by a hard-driving fighter man named Don Blakesley, you crossed the German coast and kept going. You flew past the line where a Thunderbolt would have turned for home, past Hanover into airspace no American single-engine fighter had ever held. Under your wings, 1,200 miles of round trip. Ahead through the haze, the sprawl of the German capital. The 4th put its fighters over Berlin that day, the first American fighters ever to reach it. The thing the Germans had believed could not happen was happening over their own seat of government. 2 days later, the bombers came in force. On the 6th of March, the 8th Air Force sent more than 700 heavy bombers against Berlin, the first great daylight raid on the city. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had at them, and that day cost the Americans 69 bombers, the heaviest loss the 8th ever took on a single mission. It was a brutal day. But it was a brutal day for the Germans too. This time, the bombers did not fly alone. The Mustangs were over the target with them, and the German fighters that rose to the attack had to fight through an escort that could stay the whole way. One American fighter group won a unit citation for the way it defended the bombers over the city that week. The deep raid, the mission that had been suicide in October, was now something the Germans could no longer stop and could barely survive. For the men in the bombers, the change was the difference between dread and a fighting chance. The bomber crews had a name for the escort fighters. They called them the Little Friends. Through the autumn of 1943, the Little Friends had always turned back at the German border, and the worst hours of every mission were the ones flown after they left. Now, deep over Germany, where a crew had learned to expect nothing but interceptors, a Mustang would slide into view above the formation and stay. A gunner who had watched friendly fighters peel away at the frontier for months was now watching them hold station over the target itself. The arithmetic of the tour had changed. A man had a real chance of flying his 25 missions and going home. The men on the other side understood exactly what it meant. Adolf Galland, the general who ran the German fighter force, wrote after the war that the official line had been simple. There were no long-range enemy fighters over Germany. than they were, and Galland rated the Mustang the most dangerous Allied aircraft in the sky. The verdict from the very top was blunter still. When his interrogators asked Hermann Goering after the surrender, when he had known the war was turning against Germany, he pointed to this exact moment. When the American bombers came escorted by fighters as far as Hanover, he said, he had begun to worry. When they came with their fighters all the way to Berlin, he knew the game was up. There was a second reason the loss was fatal, and it was on the ground. The Allied bombers were also working over the German fuel plants, and aviation fuel was growing scarce across the Reich. To save it, the Luftwaffe cut the flying hours in its training schools. A new German fighter pilot in 1944 reached his squadron with a fraction of the cockpit time an American arrived with, sent up against escorts flown by men with far more training behind them. So the veterans who were lost over Germany were replaced by boys who had barely learned to fly, and those boys did not last long against the Mustangs. The pool of skill drained and did not refill. Galland had warned his own leadership for months that the escorted daylight raids were breaking his force, and the record proved him right. That was a body count in the sky. The German fighter arm bled its veteran pilots away over the winter and spring of 1944, faster than the training schools could pour new ones in, and the men lost were the ones who knew how to fight. The weapon that really did the damage was not the Mustang's 50 calibers. It was the Mustang's fuel. Range was what turned the bombers from prey into bait, and range was what put an American fighter over every yard of the route where the German pilot used to be safe. Every number that mattered on that airplane came back to how far it could fly. By the time the Allies landed in Normandy in June, the sky over the beaches belonged to the Allied air forces almost without a fight. German pilots flew over the invasion front on the 6th of June. The Luftwaffe day fighter force had been broken in the months before, worn down over Germany by the bombers it could not stop and the escorts it could not shake. The Focke-Wulf that had ruled the deep raid in October was still a superb machine. There were simply fewer and fewer trained men left to fly it, and wherever it climbed to fight the bombers, the Mustangs were there. The Focke-Wulf 190 and the Messerschmitt 109 had owned the deep German sky for one reason. The American bombers had to fly the last hundreds of miles alone. The P-51 Mustang took that one reason away. Carried a fighter's guns and a bomber's fuel load, and it used that fuel to be there, over Kiel, over the factories, over Berlin, everywhere the bombers went. On the days the German fighter arm was spending pilots it could never replace. The gun that had set the price of every deep raid stopped being able to set it, because for the first time the bombers were never out of reach of a friend. If you flew one, crewed one, or worked on one, tell me down in the comments which mark you knew best. And tell me which pairing you want next. The Thunderbolt and the German flak that hunted it low down, or the Mustang against the first German jet. Say the word and that one gets made.